So our session today, our agenda, we're going to be looking at primarily, like I said, organization. So how do you organize a data set? And this is by no means the only way to organize a data set. This is just a way that I've sort of developed in my own experience with MAXQDA and having done this type of analysis. A couple of things to consider as you sort of tackle these questions is looking at what are your specific research questions, because that's obviously going to factor into how you organize your data set. And what are the variables that you have access to? You may have more or less than other people doing the same research as yourself. So that's going to sort of vary in terms of how you can organize things and how you can lay things out. I'm going to walk you through how you can actually add variables via Excel. So if you happen to collect data at two different points in time, how can you link those up to your documents? Or if you have data after the fact, or if you're basically collecting additional survey data, how can you add data onto what you already have? So we'll walk through that real quick. I'll show you a couple of strategies with document groups and document sets, and also a way to organize your code system. And then to close out the session today, once we've organized our project a bit, I'll show you sort of how you then take that organization and roll that into your initial coding. So we're going to use a specific tool called Categorize Survey Data, which is a sort of a specific coding tool in MAXQDA to work with survey data that gives you a really nice, clean interface that you can work with that I think is pretty slick for getting started with coding survey data. So that's hopefully what we'll get through today. I've got about 30 minutes of content planned for the session, and then we'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes for your questions about either this topic today or just anything related to MAXQDA. All right, and with that, let's jump into the software. So I've got a blank project file here. We're going to start from the very beginning. I'm going to pull in some data so you can get a sense of what that process looks like. And so I can give you a sense of what the data that I'm going to be working with today looks like. So I've got two different data sets, and these are public data sets that I found from the city of Austin, Texas. And they have some, I don't know if we have anybody from Texas in the crowd today, but we have, they have some facilities, some public facilities, and then they are basically soliciting feedback from people who have been to those facilities. And so we're going to be looking at two different data sets that have been collected. So this first one is about some different city cultural centers that exist in the city, and it's grouped fairly nicely. So we have one column here under facility that is going to give us actually a nice grouping. When we import, we'll be able to use this to break up our data into some specific groups. So we have four. To make this a little bit easier, if I just turned on the filter feature, you can see I have four different options. So I have four different facilities. That's pretty good for document groups. We wouldn't want too many. It's going to get a little bit difficult to understand what they mean if we have too many groups, but this seems like a pretty nice breakpoint. So we'll be using that as when we import for our document groups. Survey item is going to be the specific questions that were asked. So these can be helpful to really tailor your research questions. So we have just feedback about facilities. We have experience with staff, about fees, some of these specific questions. So you can see, hopefully, in looking at these survey questions that are asked, the analysis piece is obviously important, but perhaps even more important, this is your survey design. So you really, really need to think through those questions that you're going to ask, because the more sort of pointed, more specific questions that you ask, the easier it is to categorize things as you get going. The response is going to be the actual open-ended responses from the attendees of these particular places. And we actually have some initial coding done for us here, which is kind of nice. The auditor assigned categories, so they're looking at the response and basically giving it a basic negative, positive suggestion, which is a really great place to start with survey data. It's difficult when you have so many responses to just jump into the whole data set. But if you can do a quick pass and basically decide, is this a negative, is this a positive, is this a suggestion, That way you can sort of filter in on some specific pieces in your data set. So instead of looking at 800 responses, you're looking at maybe 200 or 300, which is a lot more manageable as you get started. The last 3 columns, we're looking at translations. It looks like they offered this in different languages. There's not too much variation here, so I don't know how valuable this data point would be for us, but it is something, so we'll definitely import it as we get going here. All right, so this is what our file looks like. Again, just a regular Excel spreadsheet. I did add this ID column. This I did myself. You can do that. Typically, if you're pulling from like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, something like that, you're gonna have an ID column generated for you. So that probably would be an extra step in my case. Okay, so let's go back to MAXQDA now. So we're in the import tab, survey data. We're gonna go from Excel spreadsheet, and we're gonna find our file here, which is the city cultural centers. So this is gonna ask me essentially, how do I wanna import this data? If you were here in the last session, you saw this already, but I'll go through this quickly again. The document group, we already said facility is gonna work for us. This is gonna give us 4 nice clean groups corresponding to the different facilities that we're asked about. The ID we'll just leave as a variable. It doesn't give us much value as a code. The thing to know here, anything we check as a code will actually show up here in our document browser. So when you're doing survey data, it's important sometimes to have the questions alongside the responses. Otherwise, you don't know what the people are actually responding to. So facility, we'll throw this in as a code and a variable so that I can see this in the document, but that I can also use it as a variable in my data set. The survey item, we'll leave this in as a code. If I pull this, if I come back here, so I've got survey item. I do have specific questions. So I do have this as a limited number, so I could pull this in as a variable as well if I wanted to use this to activate things. So we'll pull this in as a variable as well. The response should be just a code because it's open-ended. So there's not a limited number, right? We're looking for the distinction here between a code and a variable. If it's going to be unique in every instance, it's only going to want to be as a code. A variable, there'd be no value there because there'd basically be no use. Auditor assigned category, again, we said that these probably weren't terribly useful for us, so we'll just leave these as variables. We don't need these assigned as codes. Last but not least, code empty cells. Typically, you'll want to leave this blank. If you're using document variable statistics to get counts in a table or to get a visualization done up, this will throw off your numbers because it will essentially code that empty cell and you'll get false positives. So you'll usually want to leave that blank. Okay, and we'll click OK. We'll get a preview of how our data is going to be imported. And we'll go ahead and pull this in. So you can see I have 862 responses. This is a fairly big data set. Some of you may be working with much larger survey data than this, but this is a decent one. Okay, so if we close this now, so you can see I've got my 4 document groups, and this works in this layout, but I want to make it clear that I'm working with the 2 different data sets. So I'm actually going to create a parent folder here. And we'll call this the cultural centers. And I'm gonna actually drop these folders into this, right? Because these are sort of subfolders within this bigger data set. And again, you don't have to do that. This is just sort of my preference for organizing things. I like to have them grouped in this subfolder format. It just works better for my brain for some reason. But then you can see these are all grouped within here, and then my document set system is nice and clean. I've got just the 1 folder. I'm also going to group my code system too, because some of these codes response is going to be duplicated, and I want to make sure that I have those separated out between the 2 data sets. So I'm going to create a parent code, and we'll call this cultural centers organizational codes. Easy way to group your codes is just activate the ones you want, right click and move activated codes here, and you see they all drop in. Now I have these subcodes, and now my system is nice and clean once again. So I'm going to reset these activations. I'm going to change this color as well. Let's go ahead and make this orange. All right, so I've changed my color to orange, and I have my code system nice and grouped, and I have my document system nice and grouped. So that's one way to organize things, is to use document groups. So you can see, for example, here I have 199 surveys. This one's, I think, my smallest. I have only 25 surveys out of this. So obviously, in this case, if we're looking specifically at how did people respond to these cultural centers, we want to be able to give feedback or analysis specific to the actual institution. We might be doing overall as well, but by having it in the document group, it allows us sort of that that second level of refinement to our analysis. So this one's set up. Let's go ahead and pull in our other data set. Let me give you just a peek at what that one looks like. So this is the Millennium Youth Center. So this is only one specific center. We do have a piece in here, this survey item category, which sort of categorizes the type of question that's asked: community needs, customer service, general. If that was relevant to our research question, we could use that as a document group. It would really depend on how you wanted to go about conducting your analysis. Again, we have this survey item that talks about the particular questions. Why do you feel that the MYEC does not meet the needs of youth in Austin? This is, of course, based on their previous questions, right? We have the response category again. So you're hopefully understanding why I needed to group that code system, right? So that this doesn't get lumped together, because I want to keep those codes separate so that when I do my activation, I can get at the specific piece of data that I want to look at. And that's it for this one. It's pretty sparse. Again, the ID column that I've created as well. So I'm going to go ahead and import this. So we go to our import tab, survey data from Excel spreadsheet, and we'll find this here, Millennium Youth Center. All right. So we're just going to leave this, create a new document group. This is going to give us just a new group. We'll use the ID for the document name again, leave that as a variable. Survey item category, let's pull this in as a code as well so I can see it alongside the response, and the same thing with the survey item so I can see the specific question, and then the response as a code. All right, and we pull these in. So 636, again, not terribly huge. Some survey data, I've had customers that have worked with just massive survey data size. So these are fairly small, but good for a demonstration. So let's retitle this Millennium Youth Center. Another good piece of practice here would be to create a memo right away that this would probably have the dates. So when did you import this? They would have the scope, right? Like what kind of questions, maybe if this is only part of your responses, if you're still waiting for people to finish, you could include your research questions here if you have them. You can do lots of stuff in these memos. That's really a good practice to keep your notes here, to keep everything attached to the specific piece of data that you're working with. Okay, and then let's organize this one again as well. So we'll create a new code here. We'll call this Millennium Youth Center org codes. Organizational codes, basically just meaning that these are structural codes. When I get into doing the actual analytical coding that has sort of meaning attached to it, those will be something separate. So really this is just functional. This is to get me where I need to get to in the software, whereas the analytical codes have the actual meaning that I'm sort of trying to figure out. So again, we'll move activated codes here. And let's leave this one this color, leave it that purple color. All right, so we've got our data sets imported. We've got some organization done already. I actually want to add some variables here. I don't have a whole lot of variables in my data set. To figure that out, I would come up to my variables tab, my list of document variables, and I can see the majority are just system added variables, nothing terribly interesting, and my user added variables are not terribly interesting. So let's add some new variables. So how do we do that? The easiest way in this case, since I have so many, you can actually come into the data editor. You can add, actually it's back here, I can add variables from my list of document variables. So I can create new ones right here in MAXQDA. In this situation, it's not terribly practical because I have, well over 1,000 responses. If you're working with a small set of interviews or a focus group, then it probably makes sense to just do it in here. But I'm going to go ahead and use Excel since I've got such a big data set. So the easiest way to make sure that your variables match. MAXQDA is going to be looking for these two columns. These are your key columns, document group and document name. So any variables that you want to attach to a document or a survey respondent in this case, they have to have matching document group and document name. So the easiest way to do that, I could come in here, I want just the millennium, so I'm going to activate this and I'm going to filter. And then that gets me just this data set. And what I can do from here is I can export this to Excel. So let me just show you what that looks like. So if you see that here, this has all of the current variables. I've got my document group and my document name. And all I would have to do would be to copy paste any header values. So basically the name of your variable would go up here. So like something like race. And then all of your values would get pasted here, corresponding to whatever your document name is. So your key value there would just need to match essentially. I've already got that set up. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. If I pull up here, so here's my demographics. You can see I have my document name, the Millennium Youth Center, and I have, my document group, and then I have my document name set up, and I just populated some dummy values for demographics, so race, gender, education level, and I also added in a Likert response. This is going to be something you'll have a lot of in survey data, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, rate your satisfaction, something along those lines. That's a really great way to start out your analysis because you can group things. The people who are highly satisfied said this, or the people who are highly dissatisfied said this. It's a fairly logical grouping to get started. And it can, again, instead of working with 600 documents, you're going to be working with 100. So for example, if I filter this for highly dissatisfied, I've only got 71 responses. So it just makes it a little bit simpler in terms of getting started doing your analysis. Or if maybe you don't need to know all of those specific things, you can kind of zoom in on something in particular. So let's go ahead and pull in these variables. I'm going to show you something quick though. First, I'm going to show you what happens if you don't have these titled correctly. So if I call this ID, I come back to MAXQDA, and I try to import some new document variables, and it is, make this bigger. Here we go, demographics millennium. If I open this up, so unsuccessful, make sure that it contains the following column heading, document name. So MAXQDA is very particular. You have to have that specific column. That's what it's looking for to match. So I'm gonna come back, change that. It is not case sensitive, if anybody's wondering that. So that is okay, but it does need to be in that exact set. So let's go ahead and import these document variables. Okay, so now I get a preview. So I've got, these are my columns, race, gender, education level, rate your satisfaction. It tells me what they are, so these are text. They could be, if you've got numbers or things like that, they could be pulled in differently. And then I've got a preview of what those responses look like. So if I go ahead and import this. All right, now I can see in my table, and I'm gonna filter again to turn those other ones off. I've got here all of my new variable data. So I've got these this demographic information. You'll notice if I turn off the filter, the other data set, it's just blank. So it did not get imported because it's not, it wasn't tied to that particular data set. So one more form of organization that you could do is you could create a document set. So a set is different than a document group in that it is not permanent. So everything will live permanently in the document groups. So for example, this document here could be part of a set, but it lives here. If I delete the set, it will not affect it in the document group. So as you're getting later on in analysis and you're maybe shifting in research questions or you want to circle back and answer something specific, document sets can be a really nice way to sort of make a nice clean placeholder. So let's go ahead and make one of those. Easiest way to do that is to use this icon up here, activate by. You can also right click. activate documents by variables. So either way. And let's go ahead and do a combination here. Let's do race. So I double click and I'll do gender. And if I set a value for this, let's set race equal to Asian. And let's set gender, we're gonna say and. So I want this to be exclusive. So I want, it has to be Asian and female. Oops. Okay, and you can see I have a total of 35 documents in the set. I can just activate those right away, or I can just create a new set. So now I've got my set where race is equal to Asian and gender is equal to female. This can be really handy as you're trying to look at specific groupings, right? Especially if you have a lot of nice, rich demographic data or variables that you've collected with your survey, you can get a lot of utility out of playing around with these different combinations. And again, that's fairly simple. It's the activate by variables, and then you essentially choose whichever conditions you want to use. One nice thing to note here, insert all variable values as conditions will quickly insert everything. So if I do race, you can see it'll pull in everything, Asian, Black, Hispanic, or white. So I can pull in all values. That's not terribly useful for making sets, but as you get to do like mixed methods things later on, that can be kind of nice if you're doing crosstabs or those kinds of things, which we'll be covering actually in the next session if you want to tune in to see anything about that. All right, so I've got a few minutes left here before I pause for questions. So I want to show you this coding tool that you can find. But this is hopefully giving you a pretty good idea of some of the ways that you can use to organize your data as you get started doing your coding, especially if you're working with really, really large data sets of survey data. This can be really helpful so that you don't have to look at everything at once. Or if you're working in teams, you can split things up and have certain people working with certain questions or certain groups. All right, so let's take a look at the Categorize Survey Data tool. So you'll find it here under Analysis and Categorize Survey Data. So there's a couple options you'll notice here. Let's go ahead and reset all of these. It's going to ask you drag and drop a code of survey question from the code system window here. So it's going to be asking you specifically for a code that you want to analyze. And with survey data, it's nice because when you import, the responses will be auto-coded. Remember, if we look here under the cultural centers, we have response. That is the answer to the questions. So this would be the code that you'd be interested in. So if I pull this in here, this is going to give me everything from that data set, which is too much. So I'm going to pick specifically, let's do the George Washington Carver. So now I've only got about 200 documents, and I'll select only activated documents. This is going to open up a new window. And actually, when you use categorized survey data, you can't actually access the other window of MAXQDA. You're in this view until you close out of it, essentially. So there's some kind of cool things in here. What I like about this is it's nice and clean. You can see all of your responses in this nice grid format. You can see any codes that have been applied to them. And what I think is probably one of the most useful features is you have a column for annotations. So as you start to build out your coding system, if you don't have one already, I mean, again, it's going to depend on your project. You may have a system built, but typically when I've done this type of analysis, it's more of an inductive approach where you're looking at the data and building a code system from what you're seeing. So the annotation feature is a really great way to do this because you have 255 characters to really flesh out what it is you're seeing. And essentially you use this in kind of an iterative process to define these codes and subcodes as you go. So an easy way to start this is to look at a word cloud. So if I open this up, this will take all of the responses that I have selected here, and it will show me the words that are most referenced. You can see I have a little bit of false positives here with some articles and things like that. My stop word list is not so great here. I could update this to get rid of some of that, but that's okay for now. So if I looked at something specific, for example, exhibits has 18 hits. Maybe there was a specific topic that I wanted to know about or a place that I wanted to start. So let's start with exhibits. If I right-click this, I can actually auto-code exhibits with a new code. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So it's going to auto-code this, any response that mentions this. All right, and this is essentially asking the parameters and weight and things like that. For the purposes here, I'm just going to ignore most of this stuff. So I've got 18 coded segments now. If I close this out, if I click on this, it will filter now to my 18 responses related to exhibit. And essentially what I can do now is I can come in here and I can make annotations based off of sort of what the particular exhibits mean. So I can start to define what I mean by this particular categorization. And then as I've done that, I can turn around and I can create particular subcodes. For example, this one, we have been there many weekend events. So we might have a code for, we might create a code for weekend events. And we can essentially start to create more of a precise definition about what exhibits means in these particular contexts. So this is just sort of one brief example of how you might start to use something like this. But it's a decent way to get things started when you have fairly large data sets of lots of different responses and lots of different categorization to get going. So we'll go ahead and close out of this now. You can see all my codes that I created in here underneath response. My auto code for exhibits is existing in my regular code system as well with the 18 segments. So everything that I do in categorized survey data will also be reflected here in my code system. It's just a little bit of a cleaner view to sort of start doing some of that, that initial coding. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I think we've got about 14 minutes or so left. I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions. Feel free to open up your mics at this point if you have any questions about anything you saw today, or feel free to use the chat box as well if you'd rather just type out your questions. Does not have to be related to today's session. If you have just general MAXQDA questions, that's okay too. I'll do my best to answer those, but I'm going to go ahead and stop talking here and see what questions everyone has.